Hello, and welcome back to the Fabric of Industry podcast, episode 5, the Human Development Index. I am your host, Adam Grange. I apologize for the delay between last episode and this episode, though mainly an apology to myself, since I don't really have an audience yet. I had personal and family things going on, and I was quite busy as well, but we are back on track, and I have been working on these next 3 episodes for a while now. They're all sort of a part of a series on economic development, but they do stand alone as their own episodes too. They will all be essential foundations moving forward in the podcast. So I wanted to begin with the Human Development Index because I have brought it up in the past 4 episodes, probably more than anything else, and really only gave a brief introduction to the concept in, I think, episode 1. I do believe that the Human Development Index is the best overall indicator of a country's economic development, as weird as that may sound. And since this is an economics-based educational podcast run by me, it is quite the fundamental topic. I'll begin by explaining the stages of development, and then define and explain what the Human Development Index actually is, and how it measures stages of development in more detail than I did before. Then I will delve into other theories of development, and that should make for a nice full episode. So without further ado, let's make a start. I will define development in terms of this podcast as progressive and effective change intended to lead to the betterment of places and the people around the globe. But what is betterment? Initially, that is pre-World War II, before the study of global development was a prominent field, it was assumed betterment was it's purely material advances. That is, higher incomes and salaries, which meant more things for people. But then the question was asked, are the richest countries also the ones with their average populations actually satisfied? So more terms needed to be added into what betterment actually was. Social factors were understood as important, that is, health and education primarily. And freedom and empowerment became equally as important to attain as well. So we can say betterment, in the sense of our definition, is the effort to bring about change in all of these things to impact the well-being of countries and their inhabitants. Since the inception and expansion of development studies post World War II, the world was traditionally divided into the global north and to the global south. You may have heard of these terms used at some point before. Commonly, the global north refers to North America, excluding Mexico, so basically it's Canada and the United States, Europe, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand, even though the latter two aren't really in the north. It's also referred to as the West for this reason, although, again, Australia and New Zealand aren't really West. Of course, what truly is West, it really depends on Europe's perspective of the new and the old world. Anyway, the South, the global South, refers to Central and South America, including Mexico, Africa, China, South, and all of Southeast Asia and the Middle East. And a large reason for this is the global north is typically seen as providing aid for the global south, the developed helping the developing. I don't really know if also, obviously most of these countries are in the north, for the global north, and most of the countries in the global south or regions are in the south, but it could also be seen sort of as north is sort of on top of south in a sense. I'm not exactly sure if that's also a reason for the terms, but I could see that being argued in some social science perspective or something like that. But anyway, especially recently, China and the Middle East, parts of the Middle East, among other countries as well, just spotted around the world, they've been aiding the developing countries as much, if not more, especially like China,
and like Saudi Arabia, than the global north, the typical global north countries and areas have been. There is much more history behind this whole thing, but as this isn't mostly an economics podcast and not really a history one, I will move on now to what is known as post colonial growth theory. If you can picture a flow chart in your head, like one moving down, we'll start at the first bubble or box. Let's go with bubbles. They're nicer. Well, it's actually three bubbles at the start. So imagine three bubbles at the start. The Keynesian economics revolution is one of the first bubbles. Don't worry about what that is, but don't really worry about what any of these terms are. I'm just explaining how this has developed. But if you do know who John Maynard Keynes is and his Keynesian economics is, then great. If not, again, don't really worry about it. If you do want to look it up, because I'm not going to be explaining it, I'm sure like Khan Academy has great videos on it and stuff. It's not spelled Keynes like how you would expect Keynes to be spelled. It's Keynes. That's Keynes, John Maynard Keynes. And Keynesian just has an I-A-N tacked onto it. Anyway, next to that bubble, the second bubble in the first three bubbles, is the political agenda of the United States. So the reason this is so important, aside from the United States historically being one of the most powerful countries in the world, also right now is still one of the most powerful countries in the world. It sort of began with a speech made by President Harry Truman in 1949 about how it was the duty of the West to develop and modernize the third world. That's not an actual quote, but that's what the speech was essentially about. And then the third bubble there is nationalist developmentalism. Again, don't worry about what that is. These are all history bubbles that combine into growth theory. So these all go down into the next level, into one bubble. These are all the historical perspective starts of post-colonial growth theory, and in all of those three bubbles, Keynesian economic theory, the political agenda of the United States, and nationalist developmentalism, all three of those go down into what is known as authoritative intervention. This is essentially what Truman was talking about in his speech. I'm not going to go through the whole speech. You can look up 1949 President Harry Truman speech about modernizing the third world or something like that, and you'd probably get it if you really care. But again, this is just showing the flow chart of how we get to post-colonial growth theory. So this bubble, authoritative intervention, once again splits into three more bubbles: planning systems, economic growth models, and aid mechanisms. These are all ways authoritative intervention takes shape in the form of developed nations helping developing nations develop. These concepts took form in our penultimate bubble, which contains formation, which again, this goes back down to one bubble, just one penultimate bubble. This contains formation of UN agencies. This is a really big one. And then decolonization and new states being formed. All of those are in one bubble because they all are sort of relating to the same thing, while the other ones that have been split into three different bubbles are sort of different topics. Anyway, our last bubble is the objective of planned growth, in which the first world, the global north or the west, or whatever you want to call it, recapitulates the historical experience that brought them to development in the third world, or the global south. This can now bring us to the conception of the Human Development Index, which was popularized as all single sum measurements are because they are easily digestible. That is partially why I believe the HDI is so powerful, because it can speak volumes to vast amounts of people in just one number. It is also very helpful for this podcast because I can summarize a lot of comprehensive research on development stages of a country and its people in one number, making for concise podcast telling. In the exact words of the 2001 Human Development Report, these are reports created by the United Nations. Which, if you recall back to our flowchart, the formation of UN agencies is a big reason for the development of the Human Development Index. But the 2001 Human Development Report, and I quote, states, HDI measures the overall achievements in a country in three basic dimensions of human development: longevity, knowledge, and a decent standard of living, end quote. But I much stress that the HDI is a summary statistic. It is not a comprehensive measure of development. These other measures will be a focus in the third sort of part of this episode. And it'll include things, or we'll talk about things like the human poverty indexes and the gender-related development index. Anyway, how is the Human Development Index actually calculated? As stated, there are three dimensions: longevity, a long and healthy life; knowledge, so education, expected years of education, and how long people are actually educated for; and a decent standard of living, which can correlate to income, essentially. Each of these have an indicator: life expectancy at birth, mean years of schooling and expected years of schooling, like I said, and the gross national income adjusted for purchasing power parity. If you don't know what the last one is, that's okay. We'll discuss it more in the next episode when we actually talk about GDP. But just know for now that it is essentially how much a country makes and its people make in U.S. dollars. It's a little more complicated than that, but that's fine for now. But as you may be thinking, this immediately is where criticisms crop up for the HDI, because the indicator for a decent standard of living is how much money someone makes, when that potentially has nothing to do with happiness and a person or a culture's perception of a decent standard of living. But overall, it is a good indicator. Economists do believe that a level of income, regardless of whether or not it can buy happiness, if I have more money than you, I have the ability to afford better food, better, cleaner water, shelter, better medicine, healthcare, things like that. Transportation, the list goes on and on. And so whether or not those things actually make me happy, it doesn't matter, because it does correlate to a better standard of living, since I can afford increased quality in those kind of things in a lot of aspects of life. I may not choose to spend my money on that, but the higher income allows me that option. So each of these indicators corresponding to their dimension is then made into a dimension index. Now, I suppose I should define what an index is for those that may not know. An index is a statistical measure of something based on a group of multiple related data points. It is a culmination of like things brought together in a number that has, from various calculations, that has meaning when compared to other numbers in their defined index. For the Human Development Index, it is a number from 0 to 1 that relates countries' development levels to each other based on the three indexes that comprise it, which are the Life Expectancy Index, the Education Index, and the Income Index. So all of these three things just correlate all the way down and then combine into the Human Development Index. These three indexes are, of course, statistical measurements calculated from the indicators I stated previously. The idea of the HDI is that the longer and healthier a people live, the more educated a people are, and the more money a people make, the more developed their country is, because these three things interact with each other and improve the overall well-being of the people that make up said country. The HDI does not support the idea of the global north empirically, and of the global south, or the west and the rest, or whatever you want to call it. It doesn't support the idea of that split very well, because high and low HDI countries are spread all across the globe. They're just dotted all around. Yes, it is true that in the global north there are more developed countries than less developed countries, and in the global south there are more less developed countries than developed countries. That's primarily because the global north includes all of Europe, which are all very high or highly developed countries, and the global south includes Africa, which has most of the poorest and least developed countries in the world. That is why I have been referring to countries as developed or developing, though, because Korea is not in the West, or really considered in the global North, even though Japan is, but the Balkan states are, and the Balkan states, a lot of them are only medium or barely high on the Human Development Index. Now, I know I said I wouldn't do too much history, but I think it is important to understand the link between modernization and development, and how both are represented in the Human Development Index. Since I've only defined development, let me define modernization before going through the changes in the HDI throughout the decades. Modernization is the transformation of a society from a traditional one focused in rural areas on agrarian activity, agriculture essentially, to an industrialized one focused in urban areas. We will talk more about industrialization in a future episode, of course, because that's the focus of this podcast, but it is a continuous process that has no real definite start. I mean, there are events you can point to, but it also definitely doesn't have an end, because you can industrialize basically forever, because, well, we don't really know what comes after industrialization. It can certainly be tracked, like I said, through significant modernization events a society experiences. Generally, as a society modernizes, the country in which said society exists develops further, since improvements in various industries across the board increase levels of health, education, and general well-being, though again, not necessarily happiness, which is a notoriously difficult thing to track and quantify. Just think about it for a second. How do you put a number on happiness? It's kind of like the doctors. You ever been to a doctor's office and they tell you to rate your pain 1 to 10? They have that little thing with the angry face or sad face at the bottom, or the top where 10 is, and then the happy face and the green at the bottom. It kind of would be like how happiness is too, because, like, yeah, obviously, if you broke your arm, like, that's going to be extremely painful, but is that a 10? Because if that's a 10, then is burning alive also the same amount of pain? Because I would imagine it's probably worse. But then, like, if a close family member just died, you're probably very sad. But overall, are you very sad? Like, are you depressed? Again, like, how do you measure this kind of thing? So happiness is really difficult to measure. That's why we go for things in development and measuring modernization and industrialization efforts with things we can quantify, like income, because income can lead to improvements in your life which have the potential to make you happier. The Human Development Index itself was introduced and implemented in 1990 by the United Nations Development Program, or UNDP. In 1990, less than 1 billion of the then 5.3 billion people in the world lived in a highly developed country. The majority, if you can guess, lived in low developed countries, with roughly the same amount living in medium, high, and very high. 10 years later, in the year 2000, the global population was close to 6 billion, and while there were more people living in very highly developed countries than there were 10 years prior in 1990, when the Human Development Index was implemented, there were less living in highly developed countries, meaning most countries that were highly developed in 1990 moved to being very highly developed. They joined those ones that were already considered very highly developed. Most countries were medium, while the rest of the majority were still low. This also means that many countries who were low in 1990 increased their development to medium, but a lot of them remained low. This will become a pattern. Another 10 years later, there were almost 7 billion people in the world, and the largest chunk ever of over 1 billion people lived in very highly developed countries. Contrast that to in 1990, 20 years earlier, when far less than 1 billion people lived in a highly developed country. But the majority now live in high or medium developed countries. The countries who had a low HDI continued to shrink, with about the same amount of people living in very high as in low. And today, 15 years later, in 2025, as of recording this podcast, there are still about the same levels across the board. So, why the rapid increase in levels of development from 1990 to 2010, and then the subsequent stagnation? My theory, and a theory shared by many others I've read and studied about, is that the developed world has become so developed that they've encountered pretty much logarithmic levels of increases in development, meaning they can only get so close to one so quickly, but since, there's innovation is slower than invention almost is what it seems like. It's difficult once a country is so highly developed to continue developing rapidly. And the growth of countries from lower to higher levels of development is usually rapid, except for those ones that seem to be stuck in the cycles of remaining in lower levels of development. This is because of limitations imposed by technology, politics, immigration, and 1,000 other reasons one could hypothesize on the differences between countries who are highly developed now and before they were highly developed. The undeveloped world stays mostly stagnated due to the reliance of the developed world on the undeveloped world for their high activity in the primary and secondary sectors of industry, which, if you listen to the previous 4 episodes in this podcast, the first 4 episodes, you would understand a decent bit about the primary sector, and you would understand kind of how it looks in very, very low developed countries, very poor countries, generally very poor countries. Now, you can see how the HDI ties into our study of industry in this podcast. Most economic activity in the developed world is in the tertiary, quaternary, and quinary sectors, which all deal with improving life expectancy, education, and income, the 3 dimensions of the Human Development Index. The undeveloped world is stagnated because the developed world relies on them to produce most of what they need to fuel the tertiary levels and above. So the undeveloped world's resources are dedicated to primary and secondary sector activity, the manpower, the land, things I'll discuss in the next episode on macroeconomics. If you haven't listened to the first episode of this podcast, just really quickly, there are 5 levels of industrial economic activity a country can participate in. The primary sector is extraction of raw resources like in agriculture or mining. The secondary sector is manufacturing and construction using those raw resources. The tertiary is services provided with the manufactured or constructed products. Sometimes there's human services as well, but mostly it's with things from the secondary sector that came from the primary sector. The quaternary sector is generally considered education and research and development for improving the previous 3, especially the primary and secondary. And then the quinary consists of direct human services. So this is where the rest of the services that don't really fit too well into the tertiary sector, that kind of just use resources, they're more direct person-to-person resources or person-to-group resources, or services, sorry, such as government, law, agencies designed to improve living conditions, like welfare programs, things like that. Today, in 2025, the global average of the Human Development Index is 0.739, which means overall the world is highly developed. An interesting fact, though, is that there is a general lower participation in the labor force in highly developed regions that have a much higher GDP than the least developed parts of the world. If you don't really know or understand what GDP is, that's okay, but I assume most people have sort of an idea, at least the numbers that GDP can be. But the least developed regions have the highest rates of overall unemployment, which is probably a given. I just find that contrast a little strange. Anyway, now I'd like to discuss some of the other forms the HDI can take when adjusted for various factors that aren't included in the core 3 dimensions. So like I said at the beginning, it's like maybe the third section of this episode. One of the biggest factors that can be accounted for in addition is inequality. So let's define that first because, well, how do you really define that and then quantify it? For the case of development, a society faces inequality when there exists uneven distribution of resources, opportunities, and rights. Every society faces the problem of inequality. When the HDI is adjusted for inequality, according to the UNDP, the score is discounted from each dimension's average value according to its level of inequality. That was a quote. So, how then is inequality measured to discount each dimension's score? Well, first we must understand that the HDI measures the average person's access to the three dimensions of development. And then we can surmise that the IHDI, the inequality adjusted HDI, accounts for inequalities faced by individuals and groups in regards to access to a healthy and long life, education, and a higher income. It is obviously quite impossible to measure the level of inequality in all three dimensions faced by each singular person in each society worldwide, so again, averages are taken. But these are fairly easy to determine because we look for the sources of where inequality arises from, and then we track the prejudices, biases, and the unjust governmental regulations to those who are affected. Then we can use a formula, a sub x equals 1 minus g divided by u. If you can visualize that in your head, it doesn't really matter, but I'll explain each term. So a is the inequality measurement of the indicator x, with the indicator of the Human Development Index, x. So you replace x with whichever of the three indicators you're attempting to adjust for. And then g is the geometric mean for said indicator, and u is the arithmetic mean for said indicator. There are other formulas that calculate the geometric and arithmetic means for each indicator, but again, it's just a formula that allows us to actually calculate the adjustment for inequality based off of each indicator, and then we can calculate the overall IHDI. As I said, there is no perfect equality in any society, so each country's HDI suffers from adjusting for inequality, generally with the higher developed countries lowering their scores a little, and the lowest developed countries lowering their scores a lot. For example, Iceland is the most developed country in the world with a Human Development Index of 0.972, but an IHDI of 0.923. So they lose about 0.05, 0.049 on their score there. However, the least developed country in the world, South Sudan, has an HDI of 0.388, but an IHDI of 0.226. So they fall over 1.5, 1.6, 0.16. Sorry, not 1.6. Other commonly adjusted forms of the HDI include various gender adjustments, such as the Gender-Related Development Index, which account for gender disparities among the three dimensions, and the subsequent Gender Empowerment Measure, which measures inequalities between genders. So you can see that most of the adjustments are for some form or measurements of some type of inequality, since the actual Human Development Index doesn't account for any type of inequality. But inequality of many different types heavily impacts people's standard of living and their access to a better life. Betterment, as I defined at the beginning. Another important adjustment is the Multidimensional Poverty Index, or the MDI. This is actually its own index, but it is technically a sort of a striation from, a tangent from the Human Development Index. But it is a report that measures deprivations in adequate housing, sanitation, electricity, even cooking fuel, nutrition, school attendance, among a million other factors. That's why it's multidimensional. And obviously different forms of poverty, so multidimensional poverty index. The report from last year, 2024, found over 1.1 billion people, since we don't have one for 2025, found over, and it doesn't really matter because if you're listening to this podcast in 10 years, then these numbers won't really matter, but just to give you a sense of this index, the report from last year, 2024, found 1.1 over 1.1 billion people suffering from acute multidimensional poverty, which is about how many live in low developed countries. Regardless, any adjustments to the HDI are done to measure specific factors that can influence a country's development, while the HDI itself is the average measure of a country's development, regardless of those specific factors. The reason I use it frequently is because it measures dimensions across an average to find a level of development that is directly tied to a country's activity in certain sectors of industry. So I'm able to connect it to our focus of the podcast. And since macroeconomics is a study of averages, the Human Development Index is a perfect tool for us to relate and find common ground between countries. Before we finish this episode, I'd like to talk about a few different theories of development that differ from the definition and the subsequent calculating of the Human Development Index I gave earlier. To reiterate, the development is progressive and effective change intended to lead to the betterment of places and the peoples around the globe. And the Human Development Index measures betterment through a long and healthy life, level of education, and level of income. He's a Nobel laureate. His name is Amartya Sen. I'm not exactly sure where he's from. But I read quite a bit about him, and because he theorizes a completely different reason for development. He actually published a book in 2000 called Development as Freedom, which I highly recommend to read, in which he argues development is the removal of various types of unfreedoms. This is a word he created. These unfreedoms, well, I don't know if he created it, but he certainly popularized it. Unfreedoms are contradictory to self-choice and agency because they limit choice and opportunity. Think of human freedom as a web of, just think of a picture of a web, and freedoms are individual points on the web where different strings connect on the web. Where one freedom promotes other kinds of freedoms by interconnecting with them as nodes in the web, and with more interconnections, the web is stronger and more developed. Included in these freedoms can be the three dimensions of the Human Development Index, but it goes further into starvation and undernourishment, and innumeracy as well, and the opposites of those. It can be extended even to political participation and free speech. These are factors that can be extrapolated from the HDI, but are not intrinsically included since they're not measured for the HDI. Another theory is the bottom-up development theory, championed by Mahatma Gandhi in the early 20th century in India. I'm sure you've heard of him. He believed every human has the right to feed and clothe and house themselves, among other things, and he believed this can be achieved by villages becoming self-sufficient, which builds a strong foundation for a country to develop up from. Now, anti-developmentalism is a theory that has existed for some time as well, and it is sometimes referred to as post-development or beyond development as well. The idea is based on the failures of modernization and criticizes development as a Western construct. It is argued that the economic, social, and political parameters are determined by the West, or the global North, or Europe, and the United States, and others, or whatever, again, whatever you want to refer to it as. Then these parameters that the global North creates, are imposed on other countries in sort of a neo-colonial fashion, a post-colonial fashion, to assimilate the world into the image of the West. And that is what anti-developmentalism argues development is. That is developing the world into the West, essentially. I'm not sure who championed this theory initially, but I thought I would mention it anyway. And with that, it should bring us to a nice close on discussing the Human Development Index. You should have a good understanding of what it is and why I use it in this podcast, and will continue to do so in pretty much every episode. And the next episode, we will delve into sort of an introductory course into macroeconomics, maybe hopefully a little better than what you would experience in college, because my macroeconomics class was horrible in college. I thought the professor was really bad and how they laid it out, but anyway. So I'd like to think I could do a better job in a shorter time, so we'll see. But we need to better understand terms and references and concepts that I will be referencing for all episodes to come, just like this episode. So we need to go over it to some extent anyway. I hope you enjoyed this episode, however, and that you learned something. If you did, I would appreciate sharing the podcast with friends and family or strangers or anyone that might enjoy listening. If you have questions or comments or suggestions, please send me an email at fabricofindustry@gmail.com. Still haven't had an email from a listener, so I would really love to interact and talk to any one of you out there. That's a big reason why I am creating this podcast. You can also ask to join our Discord for ease of communication. I find it much easier to organize stuff and to talk to people through Discord than through email. And the Facebook page also can be found by searching the Fabric of Industry, and giving it a like would help out. And if you leave a comment or whatever else you want to do, I would greatly appreciate that. And leaving a positive review on Spotify or Apple or wherever you listen would be great as well. And with that, I'll talk to you next time.